Hello, everyone, and welcome to this special episode of the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. Today, we wanted to just take a brief moment and take a look at the life and legacy of Sir Roger Scruton, the great writer and philosopher who died yesterday at the age of 75 in England after a 6-month battle with cancer. Many of you have probably heard of the great man. He wrote 50 books. Many of them were essential. He wrote books on everything from beauty to architecture to how to be a conservative. He wrote novels like The Disappeared to try and grapple with some of these issues in novel form. His books pushed back against virtually everything that the postmodern project has brought to bear in the last half century or so. And not only that, he not only fought these things in theory, but in practice as well. In 1979, he began meeting with dissidents behind the Iron Curtain in Czechoslovakia and began running an underground university with other dissidents until he got arrested in 1985 and thrown out. He was a man of extraordinary courage, and he was also somebody who was willing to take all of the unpopular views. If you look at his life, the things that he stood for, the things that he did, he was given the Order of Merit by a dissident turned President Václav Havel. He was knighted in 2016 for his service to philosophy and academia. Anybody else who had such a brilliant career of novelist, writer, philosopher, somebody who worked with dissidents, went behind the Iron Curtain, was a cold warrior, was a freedom fighter, anybody else on the left-hand side of the spectrum, on the progressive side of the spectrum, would inevitably have had a Hollywood film made about his life. But because Sir Roger Scruton was a conservative, he was all the more essential to us and all the more despised by others. The Guardian published a disgusting obituary of him where they spent nearly all of their time talking about this pathetic little hatchet job that was done on him in the New Statesman in the past year. There are LGBT activists now that are attacking him for his views on life and sexuality. But Sir Roger Scruton once put it very beautifully. He said, "It's been a real adventure. It's been an adventure to be hated by those that I feel contempt for." He defended all that was good, that was true, and was beautiful. As Peter Hitchens mentioned yesterday, he's somebody that we could ill afford to miss in times of increasing conformity. Prime Minister Boris Johnson called him the greatest modern conservative thinker. I think that's absolutely true. We really are going to miss him. And I had the privilege a couple of years ago in 2018 to have a conversation with Sir Roger Scruton on the future of the West, what he thought was happening and how he thought this was all going to end. And so in memory of the great Sir Roger Scruton, I'd like to present this short conversation with him for you.
To start off, to introduce you to our Canadian audience, would you mind just explaining a little bit about your life's work, especially over the last 10 and 20 years?
My work, essentially I've identified myself always as a writer and a philosopher, and my work has been devoted to articulating a particular vision of modern society and Western civilization, which I've seen as being under threat in so many ways, but also as containing so much of value that it's as it were, the duty of someone like me to try and express that thing.
You have said that you became a conservative after witnessing the chaos and the riots of the May 1968 student protests in France. How
Yes.
did that really come about?
Well, I was there in Paris. I'd been teaching in a French university for a year prior to that, so I was, had a whole network of friends, and that's where I would tend to be.
What's very interesting, and this is one of the subjects that I wanted to delve into with you, was the subject of cultural confidence. I'm sure you know that there's been a lot of European journalists writing on this. I recently interviewed Douglas Murray on the program, and he talked a lot about cultural confidence in his recent book, The Strange Death of Europe. And this is something you've commented on a lot as well, about forgetting our cultural heritage, forgetting the roots of civilization. Especially for an audience, can you kind of explain what your conceptualization of cultural confidence is and why we've lost it?
Well, I'm not so sure that we have lost it, not entirely. There are people like me and Douglas who are as confident as we've ever been. As confident in the things that we value. But it is true that the mass of educated people have lost something. I mean, the education system no longer emphasizes what distinguishes Western civilization from the rest of the world, and certainly doesn't emphasize the things that we can value in it. And there is also a growing, what I call a culture of repudiation among teachers, media, and the self-defining intellectuals who want to cast off the burden of their inheritance without having anything else that they want to pick up in place of it. And this is something, it's something that's very difficult to explain in a way, but it has something to do with the loss of our inherited religion, and something to do with the fact that to stand up for anything always requires more courage than most people have.
Right, and that's what I kind of wanted to get a bit to the root of, which is that it is a very hard thing to explain, but the way you just worded it is very interesting. The burden of our heritage. G.K. Chesterton always talked about how we don't just repudiate our forebears because they did bad things. We do so because their courage and their love and their work also makes us feel very, very small, and we hate that.
That's right, yeah.
What would your perception of that be, simply because both you and Douglas are very similar in that you point back to the Judeo-Christian traditions as something that preserved a part of the culture that now seems to either being overlooked or lost entirely?
Yes, well, I don't know. I mean, everything that is valuable is in the end threatened because, we are, it's going to be as mortal as we are. And when people cease to defend their inheritance or find it, for the reasons that Chesterton says, a burden, then it is without anything to defend it. And therefore it begins to corrode and wash away. But, I was brought up to believe, as most of my generation were, that if you've inherited something good, it isn't yours to enjoy. It is your duty to pass it on. And that's the hard bit. And it's a duty that people obviously would rather escape than take seriously, like so many of their duties. And I think that's what we're seeing in our education system. My teachers at school and at university felt that they were under an obligation to hand on what they had inherited because it was something inherently good in itself. But it meant a lot of work. It meant combating the stupidity of young people in order to get into their heads that there's something more important than themselves. That takes a lot of courage and determination. And at a certain point, as a generation of teachers emerged who just found that they didn't have the impetus to do that. It was just not their thing.
One of the things that you've often pointed to, I listened to several of your lectures on this subject, was the subject of beauty and how, because our culture no longer knows how to define that and has lost a true philosophical conceptualization of what beauty is, that we've forgotten how to make beautiful things. And that struck me as it's very interesting because inside the traditionalist movement in North America, certainly, and I know in certain European countries as well, part of this traditionalist rebellion is saying modern architecture, modern buildings are garbage, and old buildings are beautiful.
Yes.
How would you make that relatable to a general audience? When you say that we've forgotten beauty and we don't care enough about beauty anymore, how would we convey that idea?
It's a very difficult idea to convey because there was so much propaganda being made, especially by modernists in architecture, for the view that somehow everything can be done anew. You can get rid of all traditional ways of building, of harmonizing, of decorating, and so on, and just produce these sterile geometrical shapes. And that this is somehow the voice of the future. And there's a lot of money to be made by persuading people to allow you to do that. And I think, let's face it, in Canada, it's been a disaster because you had a very fragile inheritance of architecture.
Yes.
Few little places which have beautiful downtown areas, but most of it just swept away. And the new thing that replaces it is nothing more than drawing board engineering, which produces temporary buildings, square blocks of glass and steel, which will be swept away in their turn. So you no longer have the idea of a beautiful settlement. A town just becomes a kind of temporary shelter put up by multinational businesses. In those conditions, people can't find in their environment anything beautiful at all unless they get out of the city altogether into the wild woods of and lakes of the further country. So I think that it has been a great trouble for Canadians. It's one reason why they find it so difficult to identify with their cities. But that's not the only problem. Of course, beauty is not just a matter of architecture. Mm-hmm. It's something which inhabits our entire life. It's what shapes our taste in music, in interior decoration, in painting, and of course, above all, in poetry and the written word. And that's where I think the major defense of beauty has to occur. You have to show people that in the things that really matter to them, that are closest to them, for instance, their use of words, their gestures, their way of looking at each other, their way of dressing, of being close to each other. In all these things, there is a distinction between doing it right, getting the approval and endorsement of others, which means doing something beautiful, and doing it wrong, which means alienating everything around you.
Yeah, when I was talking to Douglas Murray a couple of weeks ago, he said that one of the things we have to be very careful with in North America and certainly Europe, we were talking about his book, is that when bad people are the only ones willing to advocate for good ideas, we are going to be in for trouble. And he was talking about tribalism. And it struck me, in your 2006 book, Arguments for Conservatism, you actually lay out and you make the argument that humans have territorial loyalty, that they're going to be more loyal to the local than to the national or the international. And you said this before the identitarian movements started to sweep Europe like they have in the last 5 or 10 years, or you could argue since the 2015 migrant crisis. So when you see things unfolding that you already laid out for anybody to read if they'd wanted to, what's your response to all of this, and how do you suggest we have less heat and more light?
Good question. I mean, I've always assumed that it's not for me to change the world. All I can do is record the truth as I understand it and subject it to criticism and argument and see if we can come to consensus. Mm-hmm. But it does, for there to be genuine change and genuine resistance, there has to be more than one person, and it's very difficult to ensure that people will understand what you're trying to say. But it is a general truth, I think, that people only wake up to a situation when it's too late to remedy it. This is something that Hegel said once, that the owl of Minerva only flies in the dusk. Right. And I think we're in that condition. People are waking up to some very important truths about the nature of human communities and what is necessary in order to survive and propagate, and they're waking up to it at the 11th hour.
11th hour is by definition almost too late, and I noticed I spoke with Peter Hitchens several times on this subject, and I noticed that Douglas kept on saying, well, we need to find a way forward, we need to fight for what we have left, and Peter Hitchens was more or less of the opinion that he should be getting on writing Great Britain's eulogy, and that young people should move. And there's obviously a dispositional difference there that plays into those two different analyses. But who do you think is right?
Well, it's an interesting question. I want to be on Douglas's side in this, and I believe that in general one has an obligation to be optimistic, to find a solution, even if it's a compromise with things that one doesn't approve of. To relay a message of despair doesn't help anyone, really, and to say that it's all over and that young people should move is great if you think there's somewhere they can move to, but everywhere is in the same condition. Okay, when it comes to the migration problem, yeah, you can move to Russia. They'll never have an immigration crisis for obvious reasons. But who wants to move to Russia?
So I'm getting that your view is a dimmer one.
Yeah, well, my view is that you've got to fight for what you have, and you have to set an example. You can only do it locally and among people you know. But if you give up fighting, then of course you will go down with the rest of mankind. But nevertheless, all is not lost.
Yes. So one of the things I wanted to ask you, because you spend a lot of time speaking with young people and giving your lectures, and I know that among traditionalist circles especially, your work is extremely popular, and that as the sort of new movements have risen up, and there's been sort of two versions of rebellion among young European people, right? There was the people who take the identitarian route, and then there's the people who are saying to their parents, you had no right to give this up on our behalf. You have the obligation, which you mentioned earlier, to pass this on to us. And they start to seek out work like your own. They start to read people like Douglas Murray and Peter Hitchens, who told me that he actually has many young people that are contacting him after reading, say, The Abolition of Britain, and talking about how that really resonated with them. So when you talk to a lot of young people and you realize that there is a recognition among largely secular young people that something was given up on their behalf that is a part of them, that says something about them that they have to know, because their story is incomplete unless they do know it. How have those conversations given you a sense of either pessimism or optimism?
Oh, no, I think I get a lot of very positive feedback from young people of that kind, saying that I'm defining something for them that they had been looking for, and that they're always very grateful, because nobody can live without an ideal of some kind, and the closer that ideal is to something near at hand and actual, the better, because then they can say, look, here is something I can work to make part of my life and not just be something on the distant horizon. So I think young people do respond very much. As soon as you articulate what it is that you love about your country and its traditions, they will be prepared to join in. And this is very encouraging.
Because Chesterton once said that tradition is so strong that young men will dream of things they have never seen.
Yes.
And I always thought that defined it quite beautifully. When young people approach you and say, how do we start re-engaging with our traditions, what's the advice that you give them?
Well, there are plenty of things to re-engage with all around us. My own thought is that you should look for the community activities which are yours, which are natural to you, which are part of your society, the things that the discussions and debates that you might have in college, the books that you might read together, and of course then there are the churches which stand waiting to be filled. There's so much that people can engage with, which is still there, and of course it means, first of all, overcoming the embarrassment of making the first gesture.
Now, one of the questions I really wanted to ask you is, when people look at the cultural decay, when they look at the loss of cultural confidence, there's fingers pointed all over the place, and there are people giving good answers, there are people giving bad answers, there are people giving complex answers like Dr. Jordan Peterson. What would your answer to that question be? Obviously, the finger can't point in one direction, but since the let's say the 60s, when you first became a conservative, what would you say contributed most to the cultural decay and lack of cultural confidence that we all face?
Well, at the time, I suppose I blamed, in particular, the French intellectuals of the 1960s. I blamed, I don't want to go back as far as Sartre and de Beauvoir, but the people like Michel Foucault and all his entourage, Lacan, and the people who had attended his seminars, and so on. These were, I thought, were highly destructive, almost demonic people whose one obsession was to rid the world of the bourgeoisie, and to bring up young people to hate what was all around them. And I think that became a kind of disease which spread through universities, especially in America. Most French people, after a while, got bored with them and said, recognized that they were just posturing narcissists. But American professors, for some reason, went on taking them seriously right into our day. And I think they have been to blame for a great deal of the loss of any sense of an intellectual heart for the conservative cause.
When young people are looking at ways to engage, you said engage with community. So when we're talking about literature, poetry, where should people start? And in my conversations with a lot of people, one of the difficulties is that if you weren't raised on the classics, it's very difficult to start.
Yes.
And so how would you advise people to sort of, dip their feet in the water and carry on from there?
It is a difficult question. I think, if you've been raised in one or other of the churches, especially in the Roman Catholic Church or the Anglican Church, you would have certainly been familiar with the Bible and the Gospels, but also with a tradition of thinking about those things, which takes in the classics along the way. And I think this, makes it very much easier to think about our current situation. And you could be a leftist of guys like Charles Taylor, to take one of your thinkers. But if you have that upbringing, it enables you nevertheless to grasp the complexity of the issues and why it is that there is still a real live tradition to be rescued.
And then one final question is, so your books cover many different topics, from sexuality, conservatism, politics, philosophy. If people want to engage with your work, for let's say for young people, let's say for people under the age of 35, where would you suggest they start with your work and engaging with your work to better understand the world around them?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I do write fiction as well as difficult philosophy and so on. But I will say, one always wants to sell one's most recent books, of course. But I did write a book called The Soul of the World, which is an attempt to put my philosophy in a way which is both serious and opens the door to the rediscovery of a religious way of looking at things. And I would think that could be very helpful to young people. There's a novel called The Disappeared, which really is an attempt to express or to convey the situation of our country and countries like ours under the pressure of mass migration and so on, and the difficulty of holding on to things in that situation. But it's a novel with a kind of optimistic and redemptive conclusion, which I know that young people who read it find it quite gripping. So there's something that they could start with.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to have this conversation with us.
Well, thank you for inviting me. It's very interesting.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my 2018 conversation with Sir Roger Scruton, who passed away in England on Sunday at the age of 75. He will be enormously missed, and I can't help but think, when I read all the obituaries and the eulogies that are coming out for him, when I take a look at some of his earlier work and reminisce about what he meant for the entire conservative movement and what it means that he's gone, his passing again reminds us of another one of those great lessons that he was fond of pointing out, something that we should all be remembering at all times, but especially when a great man leaves us. Memento mori, remember to die. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope you'll join us again later this week for our scheduled show.